Israel has the right to defend itself. Do Palestinians have the right to defend themselves? Do Syrians have the right to defend themselves? Do Lebanese have the right to defend themselves? Do Iranians? Do Iraqis? Does just anybody in the region besides Israel have the right to defend themselves? I've seen this comment now for a number of Republican officials, that finally there's someone in the White House that unconditionally supports. And I thought that was insane. I was like, I don't, what did you want Joe Biden to do? I mean, he went to Israel, hugged Netanyahu, allowed him to come here as a war criminal. Iran is described as sort of this all-powerful entity that has its hands everywhere and it's doing everything and it's controlling everyone in the region. And at the same time, it's presented as this very, very weak government that's like one sanction away from collapsing.
Hello everyone, I'm Rania Khalek and this is Dispatches. For months, we've watched as the US and its allies have provided unwavering support for Israel's relentless assault on Gaza, while Western media has worked overtime to sanitize genocide, manipulate public perception, and justify Israeli war crimes. The media isn't just failing in its duty to inform, it's actively manufacturing consent for atrocities, just as it did in Iraq and so many other US-backed wars. Meanwhile, we're seeing an unprecedented crackdown on Palestine solidarity within the US, with activists and students being targeted, arrested, and in some cases threatened with deportation. The First Amendment is under attack, but the same media that claims to champion press freedoms is largely silent. To discuss this and more, I'm joined by Assal Rad, a scholar of modern Middle East history, a non-resident fellow at Dawn, and the author of State of Resistance: Politics, Culture, and Identity in Modern Iran. But before we jump into it, this is just part of this episode. The full interview is available to Breakthrough News members only. If you want to support independent media challenging mainstream propaganda, become a Breakthrough News member and access the full episode at patreon.com/breakthroughnews. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this episode to help us get the word out. Assal Rad, welcome back to Dispatches.
Thank you for having me back.
It's a real pleasure to have you on. Your Twitter feed is so valuable, and all the work you do is as well. And so I want to get into a lot of that. The last time I had you on, I looked to see, it was actually last summer. And it feels like we live in a different world now since last summer, because a lot has happened since then. But one thing has remained the same, and that is the way the media covers everything that Israel does and beyond. And so before we get into that, though, I wanted to ask you just if you have any general comments about this new escalation we see. We're recording this on Monday, March 10, and just yesterday we saw the news that the Department of Homeland Security, under the, I guess, direction of Marco Rubio, so under the direction of the State Department, arrested Mahmoud Khalil, who's a Palestinian student activist and recent Columbia graduate, at his home on campus. He has a green card. They're trying to revoke his green card, saying that he supports terrorism. He's currently being held in ICE detention. This is pretty unprecedented to, I guess, use ICE in this way to, help the Israelis suppress speech by activists. But I'm just curious your general thoughts about this sort of new escalation and criminalization of Palestinian advocacy in the US.
Well, I mean, honestly, it's just scary. That's the easiest way of putting it. And I think to really understand why that is the case, you have to understand it within the context of just these few weeks of the Trump administration. There's we're living with the domestic fear that our rights are going to be stripped away, that the sort of checks and balances that exist within our constitution and our entire political system, as flawed as all of it may be, it has functioned in a particular way for a very long time. And now we're seeing that being eroded. And I think this is like red flags everywhere that you should care about what is happening in Palestine to Palestinians as a human being. right? You should just care because those are human beings and they're being slaughtered at a mass scale. But if you put that aside for a moment, for anybody who, for whatever reason, cannot grasp that in and of itself, and you just look at it from a domestic point of view as an American, right? Let's say those are foreign policy issues. Those are the issues of people over there. Let's look at it from our own lens for a moment, though. This should frighten you because when checks and balances, when judicial procedures, when free speech and the right to protest, when all of this is coming under scrutiny right now, the idea that this is going to stop at speech having to do with Israel, or that this is only going to target, say, Palestinian activists or pro-Palestinian activists, that is a complete, I would suggest anybody who believes that to read a history book, because that is not the case, right? This is a very, very dangerous precedent in the United States. And I think that's what was so jarring about hearing this story. I mean, this is not, we've heard a lot of the sort of xenophobic, anti-immigrant, expel all of these, what we call, quote, illegal immigrants from the country. That rhetoric in and of itself is frightening. But then when you add this to it, well, this is a legal, permanent US resident. This is a US person, right? He's one step away from becoming a US citizen legally. And what he is being accused of is something that is protected within the Constitution. We are allowed to have critical opinions that are political. We are allowed to assemble and protest. That is what distinguishes a free country from an authoritarian state, the types of authoritarian states that our politicians constantly lambast and criticize. And yet we are now acting exactly the same, essentially. So it's scary more than anything else. It sort of sets this precedent of what speech is allowed. Are we not allowed to criticize? And of all things, a foreign country. This isn't even someone who's criticizing, in the same way, obviously, we're criticizing US policy, but we're criticizing US policy vis-a-vis a foreign country. And so the idea that we can't be critical of a foreign country, I mean, it's wild to watch something like that unfold. And then, like I said, within this larger context of fears about the way that the Constitution itself is being upended. I mean, this is the canary in the coal mine. This is what people should be very, very frightened of right now.
Yeah, it's insane. I mean, I can't. I mean, this is going to definitely be challenged in court, but that these Zionist organizations definitely workshopped this because they targeted him at the behest of Zionist organizations that want the U.S. government to essentially shut down student protests against Israel's ongoing genocide of Gaza. And this is such a slippery slope. And it's like the fact that it's after, they're going after non-American citizens first, because people will have less of a problem with that. That's how they'll see it. They'll be like, well, it's not an American. Americans still have rights. And then it'll just keep going from there. I mean, I hope it's challenged in court. I saw that he has like an 8-month pregnant wife, who was she's American. They also attempted to arrest her. And it's also still stands to be seen what collusion there was between Columbia University and ICE, because Columbia was asked, did ICE bring a warrant, because they're not allowed into people's homes without a warrant, and Columbia University wouldn't respond. So it's all so messed up. There's so many angles to this, and there's of course the way the media is treating it, which is kind of like not that big of a deal. It got some coverage, but whatever. And that's a good segue into what I want to discuss with you for most of this episode. And that is the way the media has continued to basically frame the genocide in Gaza as, first of all, not even a genocide. And in your latest piece at Dawn, you actually lay out how Western media has manufactured consent for US and in this case, Israeli atrocities. And you specifically talk about Iraq as sort of a case study, but also, of course, Gaza. So I'm curious if just from that starting point, can you break down the general idea of how this process works and why it's so effective?
Well, the reason I thought drawing the parallel of the 2003 invasion of Iraq was so important is because it's sort of like established history now. We're very comfortable with a consensus that A, that invasion was illegal, that B, it was based entirely on lies, that the Bush administration lied in order to justify that invasion. And see that the media played a critical role in manufacturing consent for that invasion within the United States, right? If you look at polling from very early in the war and leading up to it, leading up to the invasion, there's a lot of support actually, because there are false beliefs within the country. Americans believed at the time that Saddam Hussein either possessed or was very close to possessing weapons of mass destruction. We know that that was entirely fabricated. That Saddam Hussein and Iraq had a role in 9/11, also totally false. So how you get the populace behind something that is totally illegal is the government lies to them. But the role of the media in a free country, right? A free press, which talk about a lot. We celebrate a lot this idea that it's a cornerstone of our democratic society. The role of a free press, what's the difference between a free press and a state press? Well, in a state press, if the government says something, the state press has to repeat it. It's not allowed to challenge what the state says. That's what repression and censorship means. In a free press, that's precisely what they're supposed to do. They're supposed to challenge what the state says, not repeat it, not parrot it and say, well, the government says or the president says. You're supposed to, if you're the journalist, you're supposed to tell us what the truth is. It's the truth that is the objective. And in the case of Iraq, that was clearly not the situation. And one of the anecdotes, and I've talked about this anecdote, and other people have talked about this anecdote many times, but I talk about it specifically in the piece you mentioned, is in 2004, almost a year after the invasion, President Bush at the time is having, the correspondence dinner that presidents have for the press, for journalists and reporters. And in his presentation, he's joking about the fact that there are no, he has pictures on the screen as he's talking, and there's pictures of him sort of looking around the Oval Office or the White House, and he's laughing about no weapons of mass destruction there, and everyone in the audience is just laughing, like uproariously laughing at this.
And I actually have the clip because I saw it in your piece and I was like, oh, I forgot about this. And I went and watched it. And I think it's actually worth playing it. Because I think it's where this is the historical record we're talking about. And what you just laid out is exactly what happened. And this is, again, you said 2004. That is a year after the US invaded Iraq over the issue of Iraq has weapons of mass destruction. And just to remind everybody, the White House Correspondents' Dinner is where everybody, and mostly the mainstream corporate media, gets all dressed up, and a lot of politicians go to go sit and watch the president get roasted, and then also give, say basically a stand-up routine. So here's a clip from President Bush that you included in this piece that you're talking about, and I just want people to watch and hear it.
Sure.
I also spend a lot of time on the phone listening to our European allies. The conversation went like this. Hey, John, Kim Jong-il here. Just wanted to call and let you know you're my guy. Those weapons of mass destruction got to be somewhere. As you can tell from the look on Andy Card's face, we've become a little concerned about the vice president lately. Whenever you ask him a question, he replies, "Let's see what my little friend says." But we get along well. Here I am saying, Dick, if the Hunan Palace doesn't get lunch here in 4 minutes, we're going out. Nope, no weapons over there. Maybe under here. Oops, this photo wasn't supposed to be in here. This is a skull and bone secret signal. I'm not paranoid, but it was at this point in my presidency.
So I think it's really important for people to see that, and then go ahead and explain why that clip matters.
Essentially, they're making a mockery of their own war crimes, right? And it gives you an idea of the lack of accountability. Like, you can, as an American president, as a government official, even as a journalist, you can lie, murder people, commit war crimes. Everybody will know it, and there's zero consequences for it. None. I mean, especially in the case of someone like George W. Bush, he's been sort of what is it? His reputation has evolved because of how bad things are now politically. So somehow we look back with nostalgia at a president who was so clearly, and whether it was him individually himself who was totally aware of this, or people around him who were convincing him of this, I don't know that, but nonetheless, he's a war criminal, and he sort of admitted this fact, right? It was what, 2 years ago when he had the Freudian slip of tongue when he was talking about he was supposed to be talking about Putin and the idea of one man who decides to illegally invade a country and create chaos, and he refers to it as Iraq instead of Ukraine. And then under his breath, you hear him say something like, that too, because it's so clear and it's so obvious. But there's no repercussions for any of them. And then what happens is, now when you think about it, if there is no accountability, if you are within the media and the very same people who were writing headlines in 2002 and 2003, Iraq, probably bomb Iraq because they already have weapons of mass destruction, they were completely wrong. They're still part of legacy media. They're still writing articles. Now they're probably writing headlines about Iran probably already has nuclear weapons. We should bomb them now too. So this is the problem that then leads to where we are now. Those same institutions are not presenting information accurately when it comes to the genocide in Gaza. And you said this, and this is specifically, I think, the most important point, because they won't call it a genocide. Like, that fact alone is absurd. I mean, this is the global consensus. How many of the world's leading human rights organizations do you need to call it a genocide, to have multi-hundred-page reports with evidence that conclude that it's genocide, international courts, a UN commission report with the same conclusion, so international institutions as well, to then deny that this is what's happening, or in some cases to either barely or not report any of that information in and of itself. So it's impossible to look at it without understanding that there is a very clear attempt to whitewash a genocide that is being committed with US tax dollars and weapons.
It's super shocking to think that those people that you're talking about writing those headlines, on top of not holding the officials accountable, can actually go and watch them make jokes about it. I mean, that was 2004, that video we watched. I mean, at that point, Iraq was well into the bloodletting of post-Saddam Iraq that continued for years and just got worse and worse and worse. And like you said, like, nobody went back and said, sorry, oops, we got it wrong. They just continue to manufacture consent for literally everything else. And something else that you've pointed out in going sort of after the way all of this is framed is the power of language, right? So you've pointed out how these kind of subtle shifts in language that distort the truth about Israel's genocide in Gaza has an impact. The headlines they write, which you're often like going after and rewriting for them, omit Israel's role in airstrikes, in starving Palestinians, in killing Palestinians. And then Palestinian deaths are always cast as like questionable, or in some cases, if you didn't know any better, you'd think it was an accident. It'll be like Palestinian dies, and you're like, well, dies from what? And then Israelis are described in very different terms. They're terms that humanize them and dehumanize Palestinians at the same time. If Palestinians kill Israelis, it's also Israelis were massacred, Israelis were slaughtered. When Israelis kill Palestinians, it's always Palestinians died. That's it. So I'm just, and that's just like a basic concept there. But why is it that language like this is such a powerful tool in shaping public perception?
Because it does precisely that. It shapes the way that people think about it. The fact that, for instance, when a headline does finally say something about, say, Amnesty International concludes Israel is committing genocide. Well, that's the headline. Amnesty International concludes Israel is committing genocide, versus what you actually see, which is Amnesty International accuses Israel of committing genocide. And that's the subtle difference that we're talking about. It seems like, well, that's not, they're still using a word like genocide and they're talking about it. But there is a difference when you frame something as an allegation versus something that is actually being done, when you accept that premise as being true. And the differences in language, I mean, for instance, the word hostage and how the word hostage is used. An Israeli soldier is described as having been kidnapped and taken hostage, an Israeli soldier. Palestinian children that are detained and held in Israeli military detention without obviously trial or charge are described as prisoners. So why? What's the difference? Because in one, the connotation when you're as a normal human being, when you hear the word hostage versus hearing the word prisoner, you assume the prisoner is someone who is of criminal background and has done something to deserve being detained. And when you hear the word hostage, that's an innocent person who has been detained. And so the Palestinian is always cast as, guilty criminal and a prisoner, and the Israeli is always cast as a victim, innocent, a hostage. And it's not to say that there aren't innocent civilian Israelis that are being held hostage. That is true. But that language never gets applied to Palestinians. And so that's why, some of the language sometimes when you hear, an Israeli soldier gets kidnapped from a tank, there's no question as to, a soldier is not described typically in that way. They would, if this is indeed a war and not a genocide, then that would be a prisoner of war. So it's how the language is being used selectively in one situation. This is a war, and then if you argue it's a genocide, no, it's a war. But then a soldier is being taken hostage and not a prisoner of war. It's constantly to create an image where the Israeli side it's an impossibility for them to do anything wrong, right? They can't do a wrong thing because it's always framed in a way where there's a justification behind why they did it. Look at the headlines right now about Israel cutting off food and electricity. So many headlines repeatedly say to pressure Hamas, as if that is okay, as if that means collective punishment, starving people, starving a civilian population is now normalized and justified because they're using it as a tactic. Well, it's against international law, so that's not a real tactic that you can use. And to understand the difference, do you ever see a headline that says Hamas holds hostages to pressure Israel to do X, to end the occupation?
Never.
You'll never see that. Because it's framed based on international law, right? The emphasis is the hostages, because that is a crime. You cannot take hostages. But you also can't collectively punish people and starve them and cut off their electricity, their fuel, their food, their water. But that's not how it's framed. So it is important because this is why we end up where we end up. And if you want to know why it's so important to them, look at the attacks on TikTok. Because as social media, Palestinian journalists, citizen journalists, independent media have affected this narrative where legacy media can't control it in the same way they did back in 2003 when these weren't a factor. That's why they attack. That's why these institutions are attacking something like TikTok. Like, well, we got to get rid of this because apparently people are seeing things and it's changing their opinions. And there was just a poll from Gallup that showed that American sentiment, right, positive sentiment or support for Israel is the lowest it's been, I think, in it was 20 or 25 years. Yeah, that's because they're seeing alternate media and they're actually seeing things that are happening on the ground, and it's affecting the way that they think about things.
If you have a conscience, it's unbearable to be plugged into the corporate media machine right now. These outlets are accomplices in genocide, running cover for the war machine. Breakthrough has become the go-to outlet for those who want something different. But the funds we've used to start this platform are starting to run out. We'd never dream of turning to mainstream corporate funding. So we're turning to you. Become a patron. For as little as $5 a month, you can become an essential part of our fight to not just break through the mainstream media, but create something that can challenge it. We have to become completely viewer supported, or this platform we've built could go away. Don't just watch us, join us.
Yeah, it's really incredible, actually, when you think about the way that social media has disrupted this mainstream narrative. And it's also such a contradiction, right? Because at the end of the day, these are platforms that are run by the same sort of tech oligarchs who support empire, support Israel, and they'll even censor, like, the algorithm is made to really boost the Israeli narrative and suppress the pro-human narrative, I guess, for Palestine. But despite that, it still breaks through. No pun intended, since I'm at Breakthrough News, but it still breaks through, right? Like it still breaks through because people are so hungry for the truth, and they're not looking necessarily to legacy media for their news, especially people of a certain age. So I guess I'm just curious, if you could elaborate a bit more on the importance of social media this time around, because we didn't have social media during the war in Iraq. And I'm not trying to say that if we did, the war in Iraq wouldn't happen. I mean, obviously we have social media now, and the genocide in Gaza is still happening. That said, I don't think it should be discounted how important that has been in changing public opinion in a way like I certainly have never experienced or seen in my lifetime, right? Like all my life until now, everyone has been pro-Israel, at least in the Western context.
So it's interesting, the issue of social media. I interviewed Noam Chomsky several years ago, and I asked him about social media specifically, because obviously if you're talking about the idea of manufacturing consent, he's one of the most important figures in who has explored and delved into that topic. And when I asked him about social media and the role of social media, his response was, I'm paraphrasing, but it was essentially, propaganda has always existed before there was social media. What justified atrocities in the past didn't require social media to convince people. So propaganda is just another technology and another tool of how propaganda and information sharing operates. But what I think is important about it, what it shows us is these opinions that people form, especially in the West and especially in the United States, are not inherent or natural. It's based on the information that they are consuming. And when there is new information introduced to that, their opinions change. That's why that Gallup poll, I think, is so important. And when you're talking about the role of social media, because Israel's actions over the last 16 months, however many months we're in now, right? Year and a half, the genocide in Gaza has been so egregious, so violent, that this regular stream of atrocities for your own eyes, right? You could see it. It's not something you have to read. You're seeing the videos, you're seeing the images, and they're horrific images. I mean, you're seeing babies without heads, people being burned alive, children's bodies just torn apart. I mean, horrific images every single day. When this is being live streamed to people, it sort of starts to override those natural reactions that we have to violence, the visceral reactions we have to children being slaughtered starts to override the text, messaging of the media. Because at a certain point, the media is just telling you, and the politicians are telling you, don't believe your eyes. Or believe your eyes, but we can justify that. But that's just not naturally what people do. You can't, there's no justification for slaughtering children. There just isn't. And the attempt to do so, I think, is what's affected the way that people think about Israel and US support for Israel. That is vitally social media. And you mentioned it's true. When you look at platforms like Facebook or Instagram or Twitter, X, these are all American-owned and American-run tech companies, and they do censor, right? They try, at least to some extent, to censor the information that's coming in. That is specifically why TikTok was the one that was challenged, because TikTok was not censoring it in the same way. And people were getting this information, they were getting flooded with this information on a platform that has become more popular, especially to a specific generation. So that's why, I mean, they were openly saying it. There's an interview between who was Secretary of State at the time, Antony Blinken, and Mitt Romney, and they're openly talking about it. I think it's also Jonathan Greenblatt from ADL. There's an interview where he's talking about the significance of TikTok. So you hear it's TikTok that's constantly targeted, and that's because it's not censoring it the way that they would like. It's not framing the narrative that they want. And that is so impactful and powerful, knowing what the narrative actually is. And it's not because they are the ones now framing it. It's because they're letting you see everything, and they're letting you choose as the audience. Do you think that this is justified? And for most people, no. I mean, you have to be very, very ideologically and really an extremist of any, of any color to believe that there's a way to justify the mass slaughter of civilians, of men, women, and children.
It's pretty insane. Like I live in Lebanon, but I do visit the US every few months. And so because of the fact that I come every like 4 months, I kind of like always look at the population that I at least interact with and where they're at on this issue in these kinds of like eras, like in the beginning of the genocide, in the middle of the genocide, closer to this year point of the genocide. And I've seen people like the people that I've interacted with, not just like friends who already agree with me, but just people generally who I know through family and like family friends really become radicalized on this issue. Like people I really wouldn't have expected, because it's exactly what you said. The visceral reaction to seeing dead children on your social media feed. Like there's really, for a lot of people, because a lot of people have empathy, for a lot of people, there isn't anything you can say to make that okay. Like, it doesn't matter if Hamas did A, B, C, and D for real. It doesn't matter. Nothing makes killing this baby that is now on my screen, mutilated and missing limbs, nothing makes that okay. And so I think Israel has to deal with like a real PR problem. And what's amazing about the US media is I know people, like I'm sure you do too. I know people who work inside mainstream media who are just disgusted by the things that their outlets say and do. But it's just the way it works. And so it's like they have to go into overdrive to work to help the Israelis, because the Israeli PR machine is so bad now. It's why they have to go into overdrive to like suppress student protesters, because they can't convince people that it's okay to murder babies. And if you can't convince people it's okay to murder babies, you have to suppress and you have to distort. And then you end up with these ridiculous headlines. And that's more of a comment than a question. But I'm just curious, like, as you've watched this last year and a half play out, like, have you noticed that around you as well, and the people you interact with? Like, yeah, I don't know. Like, I'm not saying I was friends with a bunch of Zionists before, but I've certainly know people in my life, like we all do, who've been completely apathetic about politics, especially international politics, for as long as I've known them. And this made them not only horrified, but now they're like, oh, what is the US doing here? What's happening here? And they just have a different perspective on the world.
No, I was nodding along when you were saying it, because I have basically the exact same experience. For me, I've been following, events in the Middle East and this issue in particular, basically my entire adult life. It's what got me interested in studying it. I've, studied the history. So this is, for me, this is not new. I've been in this for a very long time, in this space for a very long time. But there are people, I mean, like members of my own family, friends, who peripherally also, it's not like they weren't paying attention to anything that was going on in the world, but they certainly, they have lead very different lives than me. They didn't decide to become historians. They decided to become engineers or, business owners or something else. But this has been so horrific to watch that those very same people, yeah, they have that like exact sentence, that exact sentiment, which is, I don't care what anyone did. This doesn't justify what I'm seeing. And it's not because what's interesting about it is this whole logical fallacy that Israel tries to apply to the situation, right? The logical fallacy of nothing before October 7th justifies October 7th, but October 7th justifies everything thereafter. And the sort of illogic with which that works. Because essentially, those who are trying to justify Israel's actions are justifying any action right? If some injustice has been carried out against you, then now you say that as retribution, you are allowed to target, men, women, and children who are civilians. Well, isn't that exactly what we call terrorism? Isn't that what it is? Like it's a loaded word. It's not actually applied to anything realistically. I mean, because a terrorist is essentially someone who is Arab or Muslim. Like it has nothing to do with a political thing. It's just the way that we actually apply it. But in its core meaning, that's the idea, right? Why we have rules in international law and order is to say that there's certain classes of people that are supposed to be protected. And if you're now arguing that no, because we're allowed to do this, because look, they did this. Look, that's the argument that is being made by resistance groups. Then aren't you now justifying that? But you can't. So again, it creates this paradox where essentially the end of that logic is Palestinians just don't have a right to exist. Israelis do have a right to exist, and therefore anything Israel does is allowed, it is correct, and anything Palestinians do, nonviolent resistance, also incorrect, not allowed. I mean, and Netanyahu has used that very language. He has described the ICC as like an extension of Hamas, right? So that's what happens to the logic. It becomes so extreme, and so because you have to keep defending this occupation, you have to keep defending a genocide, you have to keep defending atrocities, and when you have to do that, this is the only way to do it, is to exist in a completely illogical state where essentially at the end of the day, the reason you're allowed to do it is because you have the power to, and because you fit a certain racial or physical description, you're allowed, or ethnic or religious description, you're allowed to do it, and these other group of people just simply do not have the right to exist. So you always hear things like, Israel has the right to exist. Does Palestine have the right to exist? No one ever asks that question. No one ever says that statement. Israel has the right to defend itself. Do Palestinians have the right to defend themselves? Do Syrians have the right to defend themselves? Do Lebanese have the right to defend themselves? Do Iranians? Do Iraqis? Does just anybody in the region besides Israel have the right to defend themselves? Basic,
I guess
questions.
The answer is no. The answer is no if you're the American government or the Israelis.
Yeah, and that's what they don't want to say ever, though, right? So they've tried to use sort of like legalese and moral outrage as a way of justifying why things are the way that they are. But then when you commit a genocide, it makes that argument a lot harder to be convincing to anyone who now has a phone and can just see for themselves what is happening.
I appreciate that you put even nonviolent resistance in the context of something that is framed as justifying Israel carrying out atrocities. Because like when you think about the West Bank, for example, the West Bank does not have an armed resistance the way that Gaza does, right? There are, of course, like people who try to fight back and defend themselves in various parts of the West Bank. But for the most part, the West Bank is where the Palestinian Authority is in charge, and it collaborates with the Israelis. And even the Palestinian Authority will suppress any threats to Israel, like even rock throwers. Because even throwing rocks at Israeli soldiers when you're a child justifies them killing you. But you've also been paying attention to the framing around the West Bank. And what's crazy is that, Gaza was just so horrific and still is horrific. We shouldn't like talk about it in the past tense because it's obviously like still ongoing. It's just not as high intensity as a few months ago, but it's been so horrific in Gaza in such an unprecedented way that everything else seems to pale in comparison. Like if it's not Gaza bad, it just kind of is in the background. And one thing that's been in the background has been the West Bank, where tens of thousands of people have been forcibly displaced from their homes by the Israelis. The Israelis have blown up neighborhoods in the West Bank. They've carried out airstrikes in the West Bank. They've been demolishing homes. They've been killing people so much. I can't keep up with it anymore. And this is not a place where Hamas is in charge. So, this is not a place where you have rockets that are able to be launched against any part of, what's considered Israel. Yet you have this constant justification by the Israelis. And, I have not been following the media on this the way you have, because honestly, I can't stomach it. But what has been the framing of the West Bank? Because since the media is so against any armed resistance against Israel, I would assume that the West Bank is treated differently. Am I right to assume that?
No, no, of course not. It's not treated differently. It's because, first of all, there's the fact that they're treated separately, I think is somewhat problematic to begin with.
Right.
And obviously we do it too, to a certain extent, because of the way that Israel has, as part of its occupation and by design, isolated these like pockets or these areas that are Palestinian territories. But they're Palestinian territories, meaning they're all Palestinians. It's like if somebody was carrying out a genocide in California and we thought it was separate from the United States. That
Yeah.
makes no sense. But this is
Yeah.
how it's always presented. And again, that is a Israeli tactic that the media is now just repeating. That's why they'll very often refer to Palestinians in Gaza as Gazans rather than Palestinians. They don't even use the word Palestine. Like Palestine is never referred to as anything.
New York Times
So,
doesn't use it editorially. Like they actually have like an editorial line of not
yeah.
using the term Palestine, as The Intercept showed. Anyways,
or genocide or ethnic cleansing or occupation, and the issue will always go back to the occupation itself. Like that's always going to be the core and the crux of the issue. So when you talk about for instance, like the focus on Hamas, well, Hamas didn't exist until the late 1980s. The occupation was decades old at that point. So it is a way of distracting from this history. That's why nobody wants to talk about anything before October 7th, because if you have to talk about it, then you start to understand and contextualize why an armed resistance might emerge within that context. Whether you agree or disagree with it is not the point that's being made. The point that's being made is you have to understand why it exists. Even if you look at it as a problem, right? Even if you say, well, I disagree with armed resistance, but you have to understand why it exists if you try to resolve any kind of issue. If you want to resolve this, the resolution is not we get rid of Hamas, because again, Hamas didn't exist, but the occupation did. The problem is the occupation. And as long as Israel's occupation is continued, those problems will continue to exist. And that is how the West Bank and East Jerusalem and Gaza are all connected, because they are all Palestinian. And that is what a Palestinian state, whether it's, again, I am not advocating for one or the other solution, whether you believe in a two-state solution or a one-state solution. That's a totally separate debate that we're not going to get into right now. But the point is, you have a population of people indigenous to the land who do not have rights. That's the problem. They are occupied militarily by a foreign entity. So that's the part of it that's always left out. I mean, there's a lot of commentary right now about this whole, Israel is cutting off electricity. And the counterpoint to that is, well, why does Israel have to provide electricity for Gaza? Well, because Israel is the occupying power. That is how international law works. Also, Israel destroyed the power grid in Gaza. So they're not, and there's this whole narrative that they're providing it for free, as if that's true, which it also isn't. The Palestinian Authority was paying for it for a fair amount of time. Then the Palestinian Authority decided at one point, I think it was back in like 2017 or 18, that they're not going to pay for it. And so Israel is still extracting it somehow from Gaza. It's not a free service that's being provided. But when you are the controlling, occupying entity, that's what you're supposed to do. Basic needs are supposed to be supplied. This isn't what I'm saying. This is what Israeli human rights organizations say, because that's what international law says, right? Look at Gisha. That's an Israeli human rights organization. They make this point over and over again because that is what international law says. But it's not presented that way because the core of what is never presented is the occupation. And I think is the problem.
Well, yeah. I mean, it's just like the idea that, if you really don't want to, if you don't feel like Israel should have to be providing electricity to Palestinians, like it's like the question shouldn't be, why do they have to? You're right, they have to because they're an occupying power. But also, why does Israel even control the electricity of these places in the first place? Like, why does Israel control the points of entry of these places in the first place? And this
power.
Well, this narrative extends. This narrative extends the way that the Israelis portray it. Ends up extending to Lebanese territory and to Syrian territory. And recently, obviously, the Israelis are like in their greater Israel expansionist phase. And they've taken the opportunity since the the fall of the Assad regime in Syria to expand pretty dramatically into Syrian territory. They are also occupying 5 points on these hilltops in Lebanon after, staying past the ceasefire deadline. And they kill people regularly in Lebanon. Like, we're supposed to be in a phase of not war, but the Israelis just bomb whenever they want. They literally shoot people and they kidnap people. It's just normal now. And in all of these places, we're supposed to believe, and the media like pushes this narrative that everyone is just a threat to Israel. Therefore, Israel has the right to occupy everyone's land and to kill the natives on everyone's land. And I'm just curious, as you've watched not just Gaza, I've seen you also going after the media coverage of the way Israel's invasion of Syrian territory has been framed, of the way Israel's occupation of Lebanon has been framed. What are they like? What's the narrative there? What is the media pushing with those places? And why is that problematic?
And basically, international law just doesn't apply to Israel, right? It just doesn't, there's no such thing. So you could, but people do try to sort of argue, well, Palestine does not exist as a state, even though it's recognized by the vast majority of the world. But let's say that for argument's sake, let's say this is a talking point that's used, right? Well, Palestine doesn't exist as a state, so they don't have sovereignty. I mean, this is literally what the Biden administration said, right? Palestine doesn't exist as a state. It doesn't have sovereignty. And so it doesn't have, why something like why a case with the ICC doesn't work, right? This is actual language that is used. You cannot use that. You can't make that absolutely BS excuse for Lebanon and Syria, because they are recognized sovereign states.
Right.
I mean, they'll still say, they'll make their own arguments about that to sort of try and justify it. But, Iran is a sovereign state. Israel can carry out attacks on Iranian embassies or embassy complexes, which is considered sovereign territory, but that's never the way that it's portrayed or framed. So essentially, it's Israel can do whatever they want to do, and the justification is they need it for security purposes. It would never work the other way around. If the Lebanese military, if the Syrian military, if the Iranian military, if the Iraqi military, if any military on the planet occupy part of Israeli territory and said that they're creating a buffer zone to protect them from Israel, nobody in the media would portray it that way. They would simply call it an invasion, an occupation. They would describe the fact that it's completely illegal to do so. But in the case of Israel, Israel is allowed to do this, and everything under the sun is justified by, it's for our security purposes. You can't occupy other countries for your security, because now you've infringed on their security, right? That's how rights work. Like, it's so bizarre that this is the way that it's talked about. A right is only a right when it's mutual. It doesn't work if it's only one side. That's no longer a right. That is void of the concept of rights and legality. That's now just imperialism.
If you enjoyed this episode and want to hear the rest, you can access it by becoming a Breakthrough News member at patreon.com/breakthrough news.